You are listening to the Logbook Project podcast, and we appreciate you tuning in. The Logbook Project is a global journey of a World War II pilot's logbook, collecting first-hand accounts of veterans, witnesses, and victims from all sides of this horrific conflict. The project is intended as a token of remembrance and education to raise awareness of the sacrifices made. We encourage you to learn more about our project at our website, thelogbookproject.com. So, we'll just start off and say welcome to yet another episode of the Logbook Project podcast. My name is Lars McKee, talking to you from Sweden. And as always, from his tropical Garden of Eden over in St. Lucia, Nick DeVoe, how are you doing today?
I am good, Lars. It's too early to be up, but here we are and ready for another edition.
Yeah. And returning listeners will know the drill by now. This is where I encourage people to go and find our first introductory episode to learn more about what we do, how we do it, and why we do it. Or if you're inclined to do so, you can go and find our website at logbookproject.com, where you can read more about what we do and also get acquainted to some of the 250 plus signatories that we have in the project right now. But on today's episode, we're going to be talking about Mr. Benjamin Ferencz, who was a Nuremberg prosecutor during the Nuremberg trials. I don't know, Nick, maybe we should just have a bit of a recap to see where the book was at the time, or maybe just head over to Ben Ferencz immediately. That's your
So,
call.
the book actually was with me in St. Lucia. I had gotten it back because Mr. Knox had just signed it.
Yeah.
So that was easy because he signed in Trinidad and somebody brought it over, probably my nephew or somebody came up on a flight and brought the book. So that was cool because it was my first time seeing the book back from its exploits in Japan and England. And so we were really underway at this point. You know, I was an army of one, and but I was really buoyed by the success, and then it just became, I was just in a dragnet now to see who else was out there. And somewhere along the way, Mr. Benjamin Ferencz popped up. He was pretty prolific in the news, so I didn't have to look very hard, in other words. And there he was. The first thing I certainly had no idea who he was, but the first thing that you learn about him was that he was the last living prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials. And so that was just a complete no-brainer in terms of, wow, that's a fascinating story. Who is this gentleman? How do I find him? Will he sign the book? So that was, the intrigue was there. It was interesting because my network obviously was extremely narrow in these days. I was just sort of entering the vast world of World War II forums and persons, people's places, and so on. So I didn't have all the rabbit holes that we now have, Mr. McKee. I was not too distracted in those early days, right? It was pretty, like I said, it was a no-brainer. I was like, whoa, this is fascinating. How do we find him? And enter then my cousin, who we're going to be talking a lot about for the next couple of signatories, Esther Hogan and her husband Jim, who were here. They live in the States, but at the time Esther was here. She's from here originally, and she was headed back to the US. So they had agreed very kindly. I went and explained to them what I was doing, and I said, look, I just need you to take this up with you to the US. I guess by that time I must have already received an email. So how did I contact Mr. Ferencz? I got an email address for him, and sent it off. And he responded to say, yes, if you send the book to me, he would go between Florida and New York. He said, if you send the book to me at my Florida address, I will sign it and get it back. It was a very short email, but it was a yes. And I thought, wow, this is awesome. So then we started to get into the real nuts and bolts of how do I really start to move this book around. And as I say, my cousin was visiting Esther, and her husband, as it turned out, her husband Jim was good friends with a veteran in Arizona where they live, a gentleman by the name of Jim Campbell, who had been a bomber pilot. And he said, are you just doing across the board spectrum veterans, or is this, I said, yeah, sure. So then Jim Hogan very kindly said, well, look, not only will we mail the book to Mr. Ferencz, but I will also approach my buddy, Mr. Campbell. which and that happened, and we'll get to that in a subsequent episode. I thought, wow, this is
Yeah.
great, 2 for 1. So they did. They took the book with them off to the States, and then from there they mailed it over to Mr. Ferencz. There was something of a window because I had to get it there. I think it was he was like, look, I'll be here for like 2 weeks, so if you get it to me then, so that was a kind of a thing. I don't think you ever even knew about that. But we did. We got it to him in the window, and he did sign it. Again, sort of like Shigeaki Mori, very simply, just Ben Ferencz. He included a little card, his business card. It was in those days. I hadn't quite figured out the whole social media side of this, so I wasn't able to get a photo of him with the book, but his signature certainly is in the book. No big fanfare, and he sent it back to my cousin. And that was also the beginning, from my cousin's point of view. Esther sort of entered into the realm of, oh my goodness, what are you doing, Nicholas? This is nuts. And so poor thing, she spent the next, like I say, she got involved in helping me move the book around for the next couple of signatures. And she took your place in terms of the angst of, where's the book now? Has it come back yet? What's going on? And she was great, poor thing. But and we'll hopefully get them on here to talk about their experience as well. And what was cool was that they they grew up. I was born in Trinidad. By the time my father had me, I was the last of my 10 siblings. So by the time I came along, well, we were all born in Trinidad. But my cousin Esther and all her siblings, they were all born here in St. Lucia, and so they actually had a. They're all older than me, but they had a pretty close relationship with my dad. Growing up, my parents would always come to St. Lucia on holiday, and so when she saw his book and understood what I was doing, she was immediately vested in this book. It was part of her extended family, and knowing my father so well, so yeah.
Might actually just sidebar and say so many of the DeVoe family have been both involved in moving the book all over the world, but also, invested quite a bit, which we will cover in subsequent episodes. It will become apparent. So let's say that.
Indeed. So yeah, so in terms of getting the signature, it actually was pretty. It wasn't that difficult. What I didn't really understand at the time was the depth and the scope of Mr. Ferenz's service, because not only was he there at Nuremberg, absolutely, but he was also a very accomplished World War II veteran, and
Yes.
with his own experience of landing through Normandy and the whole European campaign. I mean, he was there through every part of that. So his experience is it's quite fascinating. And to be honest, I'm not going to be able to do him justice here today, simply because I have not had the time to really delve into this man's biography in the way that I will eventually and want to.
He joined the U.S. Army in 1943 and was posted to a 115th Anti-Aircraft Gun Battalion, which was obviously a AAA battalion. It was a mobile unit, and he deployed into UK somewhere in December of 43. The unit went over to cover Omaha Beach, not on D-Day, but in very close proximity to after D-Day. And so did he. The unit was a mobile unit, so it wasn't static, and they went and participated in the defense of the Battle of Cherbourgh later on. So he saw quite a bit even before becoming a prosecutor. Oh,
I have his website here in front of me, and I do
yeah,
want
I
to
mean,
read some
we can
things from
just
that. And I'm directing people here. It's benferenz.org. And I would encourage anybody listening, if you want to learn more, go to that website. And the reason I'm saying that is because he was a very public figure. And so there's a lot that has been written about him that's out there. And so even in preparation for today, I just sort of Googled his name and was reading a couple of articles. And there are some that talk more about his modern writings and his viewpoints, which again, I'm not comfortable speaking about those just because I haven't read up on them enough. But anyway, back to his website. So here's the first interesting thing about him. He's not born in America, but he was born in the Carpathian Mountains of Transylvania in 1920. And so when he was just 10 months old, his family moved into the US, into Manhattan. And he says, even at an early age, I guess wherever he grew up might have been pretty rough because a district appropriately referred to as Hell's Kitchen. And it says here, even at an early age, he felt a deep yearning for universal friendship and world peace. So that's important because his mantra was law, not war. And that did pervade every aspect of his being. I exchanged a few emails with him. Again, very few, and boy, do I wish I had engaged him more. And he would always very kindly respond. He signed around the period when uh, Donald Trump had recently won the election. So the American political landscape has changed quite a bit. And so I can't remember what else was going on, but I did write to him on a few occasions, and he was just very steady. He was like, "Look, if anybody wants to know what I think about any particular subject, my words are there. I've written a lot, but underscoring all of it is one of the things he said to me was, keep screaming." In other words, and he was very, very passionate just about that law must guide. We must be a society that is governed by law. Otherwise, we can easily, yes, it's easy to point a finger at the Nazis and the horrendous crimes that they committed. But his thing was, look, that's not a particular time and place. That's not isolated to that. That can happen. It can occur anytime, any place in the world. And so these things, these principles must guide us, must guide all societies everywhere. And here's the thing that I wanted to read about his service, as you mentioned. So he fought in most of the major campaigns in Europe. And as Nazi atrocities were uncovered, he was transferred to a newly created war crimes branch of the army to gather evidence of Nazi brutality and apprehend criminals. So in his book, Planet Hood, Ferencz writes, "Delibly seared into my memory are the scenes I witnessed while liberating these centers of death and destruction. Camps like Buchenwald, Mauthausen,
Yeah.
and Dachau are vividly imprinted in my mind's eye. Even today, when I close my eyes, I witness a deadly vision I can never forget: the crematoria aglow with the fire of burning flesh, the mounds of emaciated corpses stacked like cordwood, waiting to be burned. I had peered into hell." So again, so we have somebody who has come through, has seen the horrors of war, and then more importantly, in the case of what he ended up doing, is to actually go and visit and see these horrendous scenes that were playing out in Germany at the time. He described one scene where he witnessed, and I think you and I discussed this recently. Was it a German guard that
It
was
was, yeah, it
apprehended?
was. I can't remember which camp it was. They were gathering, and there was a displaced persons, they called it. Who was basically got a hold of an SS guard, just strapped him to the gurney, well, beaten first, and then strapped him to the gurney, and just shoved him into the crematorium.
Right,
And
right. And he was
he
there.
he did nothing. He said, you know,
Yes. And so he questioned himself. He said, does that, where do I fit in this spectrum, and so on. And I'm not, I mean, yeah. And so, but the thing about it is that you and I have discussed this many times. It is not for us to sit here and judge. I mean, yes, in the scheme of things, we have to be able to say, look, this was crazy, this was insane, and may it never happen again. But in the individual story, the place and time where people find themselves and things that happen to them, we have to be very careful about pronouncing on things like that. We weren't there. We didn't see all the death and destruction and the
it, it,
emotion and the hunger and the stench. We were not there. We don't have that. So this is, but he was brave enough to talk about
exactly. Ben Ferencz has participated in the numerous documentaries and talked about his experiences as the prosecutor and what he saw and all that. And one of them I saw recently, which is called The Ordinary Men, and it's on Netflix, and it really taking up some of the. They call it the Forgotten Holocaust, which was basically where you had these Einsatzgruppen, these mobile death squads, moving
it.
around,
Right.
killing people in Lithuania and Latvia, and to the east. And the documentary tries to factually follow one of those units that came out of Hamburg. And the reason they call it Ordinary Men is because these guys were basically signing up not to the Wehrmacht because they didn't want to have frontline service. They signed up to a police squad, not really knowing what it was. And they were bakers, plumbers, ordinary men, they call it. And they just ended up being these police squads that was then sent east to conduct these mass murders. And it's a very good documentary. It's horrific, but it's very factual, and Ben Ferencz is participating in it. And I think one of the things he said that the Germans did two errors. First of all, they recorded it. They made records of the killings. That's how they know.
Right.
The second mistake they did, as Mr. Ferencz says, is that they let him find the evidence,
Right. Right. Right.
which enabled him to prosecute them. So yeah, it's it's a horrible subject.
Well, it is, but it's this is what is.
There's numerous photographs of him with Eisenhower and so on when they inspect and gather evidence from these camps.
Right.
And yeah, it's the scenes.
No, it's heavy. It's heavy stuff, right? And so that's why Mr. Ferenz's signature in the logbook is so pivotal, because it immediately draws us to some of the most hard hitting critical areas of the aftermath of this war, that what came out and his involvement. Now, so interestingly, I am again referring back to his website, where because and this is something I even need to clarify for myself, Lars. It seems, as I read here, that he may not necessarily have been involved in what I'm calling the top tier of the Nazi prosecution. It says after Christmas he was discharged, and returned to New York ready to practice law. But then shortly after was recruited for the Nuremberg war crimes trials.
Right.
The International Military Tribunal prosecution against German Field Marshal Hermann Goring and other leading Nazis was already in progress under the leadership of American prosecutor Robert Jackson. So one of the
Yep.
things that I didn't fully appreciate, and maybe still unfolding a little bit, is that Mr. Ferencz got involved with Nuremberg sort of immediately following what I would call the first tier of prosecutions, which would have been, the top level of the Nazi government. Hermann Goring, the top level. I don't think he was necessarily involved there, where he came in afterwards and was involved in prosecuting what was the word?
Einsatzgruppen.
Yeah, I'll let you
Yeah.
take that one because I'm butchering it. But to the point of the first round of the prosecutions, as we have gone along, and now I'm sort of fully involved in developing the story of the U-boat war in the Caribbean, and I'm segueing a little bit. And the reason I'm bringing this all up is because of a gentleman named Karl Donitz, who, of course, basically was the second in command after Hitler and was left holding whatever was left of the Nazi Empire after Hitler committed suicide. And I'm actually right now reading a book on Karl Donitz because he was the head of the German Navy. And so it becomes relevant to the story that I'm doing now. And so I'm putting that into perspective because I was thinking that perhaps Mr. Ferencz had been involved in the prosecution of Mr. Donitz. And I've been beating myself up because while we exchanged a few emails, it never occurred to me to ask him, what if any impressions he had of Mr. Donitz. But my sense now is that perhaps he was not directly involved. In fact, I don't think he was involved in the prosecution of Donitz, which just from a practical point of view is a bit of a relief for me in that sense. Because like I said, I was beating myself up thinking, my gosh, I had this first-hand witness opportunity to ask him, and I never did. And anyway, but I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, but just because, as I say, Mr. Donitz is so relevant to the work I'm doing on with the U-boat war, which we will get to in due course. It's another fascinating story. But anyway, back to what Mr. Ferencz was directly involved in, which was prosecuting these 22 or 24 individuals who essentially slaughtered over 1 million people.
There were 24 commanders, I believe. that had been in charge of these scoping mobile death squads that was responsible for over 1 million deaths, recorded deaths. I mean, I think from records, existing records that they found, they could gather up about over 1 million. It's believed, obviously, to be more than that. And out of those, all 24 were convicted and 14 were sentenced to death, with four actually that ultimately were executed.
Mr. Ferencz is 27 years old, and it says here on his website, and this is just so, I don't know, these words are stark. It says it was his first case. So,
Mm. Yeah,
just let that hit you for a minute. You're gonna go in and prosecute over 1 million deaths. So, you talk about a baptism of fire. I don't even know how you would refer to that, but of course, you can imagine. Well, I can't imagine. I mean, I'm saying words, Lars, but I really, yeah.
I did not know that that was his first, official case. I knew he had done quite a bit prior to that. One of the tasks that he initially done when he was pulled into that service was to go out and gather evidence of what they had was Allied airmen being shot down. I mean, this was when the war was still going on. Airmen was shot down and then beaten to death by civilian mobs as they landed. One of the things that he did was to go out there and gather evidence and also to try and, you know, interrogate and question the locals to find the responsible people, but also to find to retrieve the corpses of the airmen.
So, so he comes out of that experience, and again, these are his words. It says, "Nuremberg taught me that creating a world of tolerance and compassion would be a long and arduous task. And I also learned that if we did not devote ourselves to developing effective world law, the same cruel mentality that made the Holocaust possible might one day destroy the entire human race." And of course, you could just imagine how how that is truly this man's mantra. I mean, you come through prosecuting a million. I cannot imagine, but you could just see his the depth of his compassion and his conviction that what he is saying is absolutely true.
To,
Um,
how do you
so
stay sane in the sense that you can keep right from wrong in
yeah,
that? I
yeah,
don't think
yeah.
I would be able to do that. You would interview me in a orange one piece suit with stripes on it with
So
a number in the back.
yeah, it's so funny. A friend of mine who we went through high school together. She went on to work in social services. And I mean, look, here in St. Lucia, we have a lot of poverty. We have a lot of people who are living at various levels of a subsistence line. And it's rough. It is rough. And she, there are some really horrendous cases that are out there that they have to deal with. And I asked, it's funny, I just met her just a couple of days ago in the supermarket. And we were talking, and I said, how do you keep work at work and detach? How do you mean the same question, same thing you just said? How do you not end up in this orange suit? Because it's a tough thing to deal with kids who are being traumatized one way or another. And she said, you just have to detach. You just have to be able to separate the two. And it was very clear in her head. I mean, she's a seasoned professional now. Now, I'm not by any means comparing that as rough as it is to 1 million deaths. And that's a whole other category of trauma for
We're,
anybody to process. Um, but but
we're sidebarring off on a tangent here, but I'm so grateful that there are other people out there willing and able to deal with those kind of things so that I don't have to, you know?
sure,
That's
sure,
and I mean
sure.
thinking about Mr. Ferencz and all these compassionate people out there that is just willing to do that, and the sacrifices made back then to deal with the aftermath of World War II. Also,
Uh,
uh,
but also, I think we need to also say here that it is a lot of it too is in the individual themselves. And so we've seen, again, we have 250 stories in the book, and there's a really wide spectrum of individual personal ability to deal with trauma, and also the support systems that you get. And my mind immediately goes to Larry Kirby, who witnessed some of the most brutal fighting places like Iwo Jima, really, really horrendous stuff that he was exposed to. And even now, PTSD was not a thing during the Second World War. You basically came home or expected to go back into civil life and get on with it. And so a lot of people crawled into a bottle and whatever other coping mechanisms they could figure out to try and deal with the horrors
Yeah.
of what they saw. But Larry was a case where, having come through all of that, somehow they were actually concerned about him, and they did a lot of evaluation on him, and they
Yeah.
I think they were a little nervous about setting him back out into civil life. I think even then, even with that level of unrecognition, as it were, for PTSD at the time, he had been through such horrible things that they pulled him out for a side study. And then he was, when I say quote unquote fine, but Larry was one of the most, like, he never complained per se about PTSD. And he would talk about things like, I would see my friends, I would see those who served next to me, I would see their faces every morning.
Mm.
But in terms of suffering with that trauma, somehow he was able to navigate that. So it's a fascinating thing, our
Yeah,
individual
it
ability
is. And
to,
there's
to
this joke or meme or whatever you like to call it that says that behind every successful man is a, a strong woman.
yes,
And that's a common theme behind a lot of these veterans dealing with a lot of trauma. I mean, I'm thinking about Larry and how his wife supported him through both of the lives.
yes. Gosh, they were so devoted to each other. Well, just one final thing to say about that. I had other veterans' wives tell me that, yes, it would be you would be afraid to go to sleep some nights because they would literally wake up in the middle of that
Mm.
fight, and the spouses would become the enemy in those nightmare moments. I had people tell me that. But anyway, so then going back to Mr. Ferencz, so he comes out of this thing, and as I say, he becomes convinced that we need, as he says, a global system of law so that we don't, descend back into this insanity of just outright killing with no regard, and the kind of genocide that occurs. And so it says in 1970, it was only natural, and of course, this is against the backdrop of Vietnam.
Yeah.
It was only natural that his mind should turn to the need for a peaceful world, and after careful deliberation, he decided that he would gradually withdraw from private practice and dedicate himself to studying and writing about world peace. And so that's exactly what he did. And then he was also then instrumental in establishing the International Criminal Court. And again, you can go on and read a lot about that on his website. But so this was this gentleman's passion, as I say, a very public figure. In fact, one of his last interviews was with Christiane Amanpour. So anybody can go out there and look at that. So he, again, very public figure, and didn't mince words, and was not afraid to call out contemporary modern day leaders for war crimes, including the Americans themselves. And as he said in an email to me, and I love this, his thing was just keep screaming. In other words, keep banging the drum. The fight for peace. I think in one email I must have asked him, if he ever got, what his thoughts for the future were, and he said he was encouraged because he felt that young people had a sort of a drive, and he sensed that there was a drive amongst the young for a better world, and that gave him a lot of encouragement. But his thing was, look, keep screaming, keep banging the drum for peace,
Keep screaming.
keep working to a peaceful solution. And because his thing was, and you don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure this out. The atomic bomb that was dropped, the two that were dropped in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, are so much. The destructive power of what is available today is so many times more than what was dropped in 1945. And yeah, we're on a path to Armageddon if we don't get this right. I mean, the options are just few. So thank you, Mr. Ben Ferencz, for your life work. The power that is available to us today as destructive forces is infinitesimally greater than what was dropped in Japan in 1945. And so with that comes an absolute responsibility to create a world that is governed by the rule of law. And that was what this man dedicated his life to. And it would be to our folly to ignore the scope and the breadth of his work, and also to ignore the if it is to our detriment to ignore his life experiences and what he went through, and the million deaths that formed his first case. I mean, that kind of, that kind of a legacy, of a resume. I mean, who could ever stand up to say, yes, I can compare myself to that? It's impossible. And God forbid it should ever happen again. So, so these are the lessons that are there for us to take. And Mr. Ferencz's signature is in the logbook. I mean, that one alone, you talk about the gravitas is a word we use. Um, it's staggering, just to see that.
As we sit here and speak today, it actually sinks in. And I mean, I've done my research and I've looked in it, but it kind of sinks in now, Nick.
It
We must
absolutely,
never stop screaming.
no, we mustn't. And I must find that email because it's great. Well, I guess this is a good place for us to wrap up. I would encourage anybody to go out there and look at some of Mr. Ferencz's interviews. It's really a fascinating story, his life work. I'm sure we've only just begun to, if anything, we've just ignited your imagination here today. And even I need to go back and read more about his stuff. And if you take away anything from today, is I would encourage you, yeah, just go and do a little bit of your own reading on him. Fascinating gentleman, fascinating work, fascinating life story with real lessons for us to take away today.
We will continue to keep screaming on our next episode, where we get to talk about veteran Mr. Campbell with Hogan's Heroes.
His name is Jim Campbell, a bomber pilot who was a friend to my cousin and her husband. The book came back from Mr. Ferencz, and then my cousin and her husband, Esther and Jim, went and met with his buddy. And it's a great, great story. Jim Campbell was a bomber pilot, I guess a la the Masters of the Air series, which is on right now, which is a great watch. And so, we'll get into that subject. We'll hopefully have Esther and Jim join us, and they'll tell us, in their own words about this gentleman who was his friend. He's since passed away now, but it's a great story. And I think, well, yeah, they were sort of the first word of mouth facilitators then that entered into the logbook project, and we've had so many since then. So I look forward to jumping in, to having them on board and telling us. And then Esther's own, you have to hear it in Esther's own words. You're going to be such a kindred soul with her, where she would just sort of, every day she would be like, oh my God, is the book come back yet? Or what's going on with the book? Or where's the book? She was there. Every time it would come back, she would like,
What you're saying is that I can relate.
you can certainly relate. She would crack open a bottle of wine and be like, oh, thank God it's here. but but they have been such a great support that I'm looking forward to having them join us for sure.
Well, until our next episode, we will keep screaming,
Yes,
I guess.
keep screaming.
Thank you all for listening, and please tune in to one of our other episodes, and we'll hear you the next time. You have just listened to an episode of the Logbook Project podcast, a non-profit initiative seeking to illuminate and preserve some of the veteran legacies of World War II. To contact us or obtain more information about our project, please visit our website, thelogbookproject.com. We would love to hear from you, and thank you for listening.